and of Asia Tychicus and Trophimus. Paul had with him a large sum of money from the Gentile churches, which he proposed to place in the hands of the brethren in charge of the work in Judea. That's good public relations. Because of this, he made arrangements for these representative brethren from various contributive churches to accompany him to Jerusalem. Yes, not only good public relations, but the Jews in Jerusalem were being persecuted and they needed it. Now listen to this last paragraph very closely. Quote, at Philippi, long way around now, he can't get to Jerusalem in time for Passover, but at Philippi, Paul tarried to keep the Passover. He did what? Still walking the walk. Only Luke remained with him, the other members of the company passing on to Troas to await him there. Yes, they went by ship. The Philippians were the most loving and true-hearted of the apostles' converts. And during the 8 days of the feast, he enjoyed happy communion with them. Now, friends, I don't want to belabor a point. But once again, if the text had said, at Philippi, Paul tarried to keep the Sabbath, instead of saying Paul tarried to keep the Passover, oh, wouldn't we be delighted? Paul didn't keep the Passover to placate the Jews any more than he kept the Sabbath to placate the Jews. He kept it with his predominantly Gentile converts at Philippi, a city where there was no synagogue. Well, we're getting into some very exciting things. I don't want to lose any of you because we're going to get deeper and richer very shortly, and we're going to see more and more of the statutes in the New Testament. But right now we're going to take a break and a chance to refresh yourself, maybe reverse a little bit and look at some things again, or just take a break, and we'll be right back. Then push the pause button again, and we'll be bringing more of the story. New discoveries from Old Manuscripts indeed. Well, welcome back. We had a nice break. I hope you did too. When we left, we were discussing Paul keeping the Passover with his Gentile converts there in Philippi. Now, to a statute keeper, it makes sense. If they were his converts, then who had taught them the Passover in the first place? So, actually, what have we seen so far? And keep in mind that Ellen White once said, in fact, it's reported 2 or 3 times, that the festival of the Jews was done away with forever, and pretty soon we're going to have to put that together with what we're seeing and find that it doesn't contradict. But right now, let's look and see that Paul was, quote, writing to keep Passover at Corinth, delaying at Ephesus for the Feast of Pentecost, wanting to keep Passover at Jerusalem, keeping Passover and unleavened bread at Philippi, and determined to get to Jerusalem in time for the next Feast of Pentecost. Did you ever wonder why he did all of that? Was he actually still walking the walk? Was he still keeping the customs of the Jewish fathers? Well, at the end of his ministry, he certainly said he was. In fact, in Acts 28:17, he told his Jewish friends that he had committed nothing against the customs of their fathers. Then why do so many scholars interpret some of his writings as though he did? We'll look at all of those writings in the near future, and we'll see that he really didn't. Well, the story picks up in Acts 20, verse 6, where it says, quote, and we sailed from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread, and came unto them in Troas in 5 days, where we abode 7 days. Yes, he's really taking a long way around to avoid that terrible confrontation against those who wanted to take his life. In fact, even this experience, going from Philippi down to Troas, added 5 days to it, plus all the slowness of the travel up to Philippi. But Paul finally left Philippi, but not until after the full 8 days of the feast was completed. no more than he left Ephesus until after the Feast of Pentecost was completed. Are you finding this interesting? Philippians 4:9 is certainly a powerful text. For the book of Philippians is written back to that church where he had just kept the Passover and unleavened bread. Now notice what he tells them in the letter that he writes to them. Quote, "Those things which ye have both learned and received and heard and seen in me, do, and the God of peace shall be with you." Those things which ye have both learned, received, and heard, and seen in me, do. Friends, what was the last thing they saw him do? Keep the feast. Did you know that in the very next century, Polycarp wrote some interesting words about this text? I'm going to call them up on the screen for you. From Masterpiece of Christian Literature. Quote, "His," Paul's, "purpose in writing to the Philippians was not to advance new and original ideas, but to remind the church at Philippi of the faith which it had been taught." Friends, it had been taught the same thing that was taught from the statutes. Actually, how long had these things really been taught? Did you know that they had been taught before Polycarp and before Paul, and even long before Moses, who lived 1,500 years before either one of them? In fact, why not trace these things from Moses all the way back to creation? You know, a lot of people think these things were all added because of sin at the cross, but not this part. Let's take a look. We're looking at Echoes from Mount Sinai, which was about 1,500 years before Paul, and listen to the writings of Moses. Quote, "Therefore thou shalt love the Lord thy God, and keep his charge, and his statutes, and his judgments, and his commandments always." You notice the word love in the text? Obedience to God is always considered an expression of love. Now, about 400 years before Moses is the story of Joseph. Everyone admires Joseph because of his integrity. A wonderful person. The story of Joseph should be told to every early teen. But from Psalms 81, 3 through 5, notice what it says. "Blow up the trumpet in the new moon in the time appointed." The time appointed is moed in Hebrew. "On our solemn feast day." What solemn feast day was appointed at a new moon? Well, the answer, the Feast of Trumpets, on the new moon of the 7th month every year. The text goes on, "For this was a statute for Israel and a law of the God of Jacob." Was the Feast of Trumpets originally a law of Jacob or a law of the God of Jacob? Right away you see it's a law of the God of Jacob, Jacob who lived centuries before Moses. The text goes on, "This he ordained in Joseph for a testimony when he went out through the land of Egypt." Oh, friends, he may have a hard time learning the language at first when he went to Egypt, but he certainly understood the Feast of Trumpets. And you might wonder why the Feast of Trumpets. Trumpets was a warning of judgment to come, what was about to happen to Egypt. Now, Joseph's great uncle Lot lived 3 generations before Joseph. And a statute keeper sees his story as something awesome. Notice in Genesis 19:3, "And he," speaking of Lot, "pressed upon them," them were angels appearing as men, "and he pressed upon them greatly, and they turned into him, and entered into his house, and he made them a feast, and did break unleavened bread, and they did eat." What kind of a feast? What did they have? Unleavened bread. Now, Lot would have provided the very best food that he had for his guests, and I'm sure he did, except for the bread. And when it came to the bread to his special guest, he gave them flat, tasteless, cooked dough. Why do you suppose? 1 week of unleavened bread is commanded in the statutes later, but evidently known by Lot as well as Joseph and Abraham. Lot may well have sensed that his visitors were holy men, and he wasn't about to break the statute in their presence.